Thank you. I'm really moved. I appreciate that. I feel the waves of energy and enthusiasm here. And I appreciate, Jim already thanked you, but I thank you for coming and braving the early morning hour. Today we are going to talk about sequences. And I'm wondering how many people here have heard the term sequence? Okay, let the record show that most everybody's heard the term sequence. So you know what that means? It means that we're done. Thank you, thank you. And you can see what a teacher I can be, that I can take care of this and so quickly. In our field, one of the problems that our field has, if you want to call it a problem, is that the terminology, there's a lot of words have many meanings. So I have a very specific use for the word sequence and a specific methodology in mind when I talk about sequences. And this is not something that I invented myself. The sequence approach to screenwriting has a long historical tradition, and it has been revived over the last couple decades. So basically what I'm doing is sharing with you today some information that's been around that I hope will help you realize your dream, to help you write the best scripts that you can write. So now you probably heard the phrase that hope is not a plan, and I have a plan for this morning. The plan is we're going to talk, before we actually get to the heart of the matter of of sequences, I'm going to take a step back and talk about how a screenplay actually works. Then we're going to get through a definition of them. We're going to give a historical overview of what the sequence approach has been and meant. We're going to talk then how sequences work in the context of a feature-length script. Then I'm going to go through a couple specific examples of movies and how they break down by sequence. And then I'll give you some final notes about how you can apply them specifically to your own work. So that's the plan. And before we get started with that, I have a little story to share. It may seem unusual that in the middle of a screenwriting seminar I would actually want to tell you a story, but that's the plan. This is a story that was told to me by a man named Samson Raphaelson. He worked with a director named Ernst Lubitsch, and I had the privilege of studying with him when I was a student at Columbia back in the 80s, when he was in his 80s. And he told this story that he said took place at the turn of the last century, and it involved a retired British officer who was sitting one day with his grandchildren around his knee. And the grandchildren said, "Grandpa, can you tell us a story about your time in Africa?" And he said, "Why, yes, I think I can do that, yes. There was one occasion when I was deep in the jungle hunting a wounded lion. This is the most dangerous kind of lion there is. I was deeper in the jungle than I have ever been. I was so deep that my guide deserted me and I was all alone. I continued on nonetheless. And there, in the middle of a clearing, deep in the jungle, the wounded lion turned and he saw me. He began to charge. I raised my gun and pulled the trigger. The gun jammed. I threw the gun down and I began to run. Ran as fast as I could. And then I stopped abruptly when I came to the edge of a vast abyss, a mile deep and 10 miles wide. I turned, the lion was almost upon me. I began to run to my right. And there I saw a herd of wild elephants coming at me. The lion was almost upon me. I began running the other direction, and there I saw a herd of wild rhinoceri coming at me that way, ready to run me through. The lion was about to leap. Elephants were about to trample me. The rhinoceri were about to run me through, and the abyss was gazing up at me, a mile deep and 10 miles wide. And the grandchildren said, "Well, what did you do, Grandpa? What did you do?" I'm sorry. I got off a little bit there. A little off topic. I'm sorry, we're running a little bit behind. Let's go on. How was screenplay? What's the issue? You want to know what happened? Okay, well, it's just an imaginary story. Those aren't real people. He made it up. And I told you most of it. I mean, it's like you have a piece of chocolate cake. You don't need to eat all the chocolate cake to enjoy it. And I gave you almost the whole thing. There's only a line left. Why? That's the question. Why do you want to know what happens next? That's critical to our task in relation to that issue of how does a screenplay work? The most basic problem you have. Before you do anything else, you may have the most incredible characters, the most vivid images, the most profound themes in your head, and you may put them on the paper, but if nobody's wondering what's going to happen next, it doesn't mean anything because they won't get to it. So, because I'm a merciful person, I will let you in on the end of that story. And I hope I haven't ruined it entirely. I'll rewind back to the point where the lion was almost upon me. The elephants were about to trample me. The rhinoceri were about to run me through, and the abyss was gazing up at me, and I had nowhere to go. And the grandchildren said, well, what did you do, Grandpa? What did you do? He said, well, what could I do? I got killed. Now, Ray Filson told that story because he said that the basic task of a screenwriter is to put a character in that situation and get him out without getting him killed. See? I tell it for the different reason, so you'll get a sense of what anticipation is. And now you get Samson Ray Filson's wisdom this morning in addition to my own. So you're already way ahead of the game. Now, let's talk about how a screenplay works. As I say, a screenplay is not an inanimate object if it's successful. It isn't just paper, brads, and three-hole punch and ink. It has to be a living thing in the sense that you want someone to read it, and it has to scream out to them, make me into a movie. Or, at the very least, buy me, and pay a lot of money for it. And the question is how you do that. How many people have heard that you need to hook an audience in the first 10 pages of a screenplay? Okay, most people have heard that. And I think there's wisdom to that. But I'm here to tell you today that there's no reason why you can't hook an audience from the first page. All you have to do is raise a question in the audience's mind on page 1 and promise them an answer on page 2. And people being what they are, they're going to give you the page because they want to know. You might even have a lion thing going on, and then you'll turn to the next page. And then when you get to page 2, though, you answer the question, but just partially, and then you raise a few more questions, and you promise an answer on page 5, for example. And then they'll give you a few more, and then hopefully by the time you're on page 10, they're into it, and they don't know why. They're into it. But the question is how? How does a storyteller manage that? I have a quote from E.M. Forster. The most basic task of the storyteller is to make the audience want to know what's going to happen next. And he also said the biggest problem that a storyteller may have is making the audience not want to know what happens next. So that's the thing you want to avoid. There are, in the last couple thousand years of dramatic writing and the last century of screenwriting, there have been, in the main, developed 4 major tools of engaging an audience attention. And I'll introduce you to these. Some you may have heard of, some not. And as I say, there are various meanings or definitions or terminology used in our field for these. The first one, this is in order of ascending, shall we say, emotional impact. The first is something called telegraphing. It's also something you might have encountered it called advertising, or you might have heard it called pointing. Playwrights at the turn of the last century would call it actually finger posts. This is simply literally telling the audience what's coming. So somebody might say, a character may say, meet me at Jerry's Juiceteria at 5 o'clock, and I'll spill my guts out to you. And that tells the audience literally where this story is going. And keep in mind that unlike a novel, Drama is particularly obsessed with the future. A novel is something that happened in the past. Somebody, you have a narrator, and the narrator tells you something that happened already. A drama, since the beginning, has been something that hasn't happened yet. It's literally going to happen right in front of your eyes. So you have a particular responsibility to keep the audience eyes on the future. And when you have a person saying something like that, and this particular example of telegraphing is called an appointment. Somebody makes an appointment. You know, meet me at the Stuffed Pig at 7 o'clock. That's an appointment. Then the audience isn't confused when you go there, and it has a sense of where you're going. And it also helps because cinema is very selective. You don't, unless you're Andy Warhol, you don't just start the camera and keep it running for 12 hours. You pick out what the moments are that you're going to show the audience. And if you tell the audience where they're going, when you get there, they won't be confused. So it helps keep us oriented, and keep us oriented to the future. Another example of telegraphing is what's called a deadline or a ticking clock. This is, you know, get the Duke back by midnight or I lose $400,000. Somebody says that, then you've got not only an appointment, but you have a deadline. The closer you get to that, the more intense things get. And this is very useful. You'll see it over and over again, the use of telling people this, that all happened a week before Christmas, you know? And then you have the sense that whatever's going to happen is going to happen on Christmas Day. And that's something that's rather commonly used. Telegraphing, it's rare that you will see that this can sustain a whole movie. But there are examples where it's been very important. How many people here have seen American Beauty? Okay, that was a very successful film. And there were 3 lines of voiceover in it, without which my suspicion is that it would not have worked very well. The first one happens in the opening aerial view of the suburbs, where a disembodied voice says, "In a year I'll be dead," which is quite literally a deadline. Now, what does that do? Well, it tells the audience that there's something coming here. And it frees you up so that then you can start exploring all the comic and dramatic situations that arise from a marriage falling apart without having to worry about the traditional dramatic type structure. You can keep it wide open. Then 2/3 of the way through that movie, you remember he comes back and he says, "In a week I'll be dead." Just in case you forgot, it's telling you it's coming. And then late in the movie he says, "Every day is the next day of the rest of your life except your last day. So now you know this is it. The deadline is upon us." And those just little touches are enough to let the audience relax. It's okay, we know where we're going, now just enjoy the ride. So it can work to your advantage in that way, but it's rare. The other one is something you maybe haven't heard of much. It's something called a dangling cause. And this is a term that arises from the fact that the experience of screenwriters in particular, that initially films were short. So you have cause and effect. Actually, initially, there were sometimes just effects and no causes. They would just have shots of somebody making goofy faces, and that was enough for the audiences. Then you start to get narrative stories, and somebody, man wants, boy wants girl, say, or boy wants to kiss girl. So he kisses her, cause and effect. As movies get longer, they discover that you can have someone make a declarative statement, like, I will get that girl, make a prediction. And then instead of resolving it right away, you let that dangle over the course of several other scenes, and then you pick up the effect later. So a dangling cause, it carries more emotional weight than telegraphing. It's generally an expression of hope, an expression of fear, a prediction of some kind, a warning, don't you ever let that happen again. And when you say that, you're thrusting the audience attention into the future. Those are elements of the future. So dangling cause. Now, this morning, you may remember, do you have any examples of telegraphing that I used today? In the beginning, I had the slide up that says, we're going to do this, 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 and this, okay? And the reason I do that is just to let you know what's coming, so you can relax and you can focus. I also issued a dangling cause, which was that I hope this is going to help you realize your dreams. Now, I imagine that's going to dangle a few more than just a feature-length script. I hope within a few weeks, you'll realize your dreams. It may dangle a little bit longer than a movie, but the hope is there. So the expression is there. Okay, so these are things that you can use just to orient the audience. The next one In terms of dangling cause, there's also something known as a dialogue hook. Like, you will never work in this town again. And somebody says, oh yeah? And then the next shot of them, they're dressed as a woman going to an audition. So you have actually literally a hook, something, a line of dialogue that hooks you right into the next sequence. And these kinds of things, you see, are the kinds of things you could put on page 1. And you could raise curiosity. And you can get us oriented to the future. And those are things that'll keep us turning the page. Okay, the next one you probably heard of, something called ironic tension. And this is a tool that becomes, it's the next magnitude greater in terms of emotion. This is something that you, it's simply, the audience knows more than one or more of the characters on screen. And what that does is it creates anticipation around the question of what's going to happen when the truth comes out. What's going to happen when the character realizes that, you know, so-and-so is plotting against them? And will they realize in time? So ironic tension creates an unstable situation. It's difficult to sustain a whole feature film with these, but, and it has been done, and often with comedies. In Being There, if you've ever seen Being There, a movie from 1979, it doesn't have a lot of forward motion in the traditional way a movie is expected to. But there is a secret. The guy has a secret, and the audience knows about it, and he's fooling everybody. So we tune in because we want to say, how far is this going to go before the truth comes out? And it can work that way. Parts of the movie Harvey deal with this issue of ironic tension. Again, studied in a comic way. The Shop Around the Corner, or You've Got Mail, dealt with the same issue. People who don't know what's going on, and the audience knows. And it helps sustain it. But again, it tends to be more comedies. For something longer, you need something more potent. And that, we have the comic and dramatic flavors of ironic tension. And the dramatic flavor would be a bomb under the table and nobody knows about it. We're in suspense. Comic is you have implications of things that people don't realize because they don't know something, and it makes it fun. Okay, the big tool that you're all familiar with, and if you read any books, you'll read about it, is this thing called dramatic tension. And dramatic tension is usually stated like this. Somebody wants something, and there's obstacles to getting it. And what that does is it puts the audience into the future because they want to know, are they going to get it or not? So you pose this question to the audience, and they'll tune in because they want to know the outcome. And this is the one that sustains most of the movies you see. It has all kinds of variations, and it can be very powerful. This is, as I say, it's the most powerful, most common tool that you'll see. You may have heard, I'm sure you've heard of the notion of the 3-act structure. The 3-act structure, some people say there are 4 acts, some people prefer other kinds of variations. I prefer to think in terms of 3 acts because what dramatic tension does is it poses a question, called by some the main dramatic question. A boy wants a girl, the question is, will the boy get the girl? So in a process of a question, you pose the question, you deliberate on it, and you answer it. 3 parts. You don't need any more, and you can't get by with any less. Earlier this morning, we had an example of me posing a question, and I'm not giving you the answer, and it wasn't satisfying. So you'll see that it works that way. It works nicely by 3s. There are other reasons relating to sequences and scenes in which it's useful to think of drama in 3 parts. But basically, the easiest way to think of it is Act 1, you pose the question. Act 2, you deliberate on it. And Act 3, you get the answer in some way. And that applies not only to overall movies, but also sequences and scenes. Now, did I do any dramatic tension today? Well, I did. You can see that I'm trying to convey something to you. I don't know how big the obstacles are. You may argue that I'm, the gap that exists between us is something I'm trying to bridge. But there's not a lot of dramatic tension here, but you can see there's something. The one thing that I probably haven't done much of is something called, the dramatic irony. Because it's very difficult in a one-person show to convey something to the audience that the character doesn't know, because I'm the one who's telling you everything. So if you're going to make it work, You have to figure out a way to convey information to the audience that I don't know about and that I don't see. And then if you have that, then you'll be able to realize that. But otherwise, you don't. You'll be lost, and you won't be able to do that. So it's something that to keep it. What? What? Stop it! Okay, so comic. Okay, that's comic irony. We're back. Okay, that's an example of comic irony. I didn't want to try dramatic. In the post 9/11 world, I don't want the thing to say there was a bomb somewhere. We're not going to go there. But anyway, so those are the basic tools that screenwriters and dramatists have used over the years to get this job done of keeping people interested. Okay, now we turn to the question of sequences. What is a sequence in the way I use it? A series of scenes united by with some element that unifies them. And the ways that they're unified, the most common is dramatic tension. It's like a 15-minute little movie inside a bigger movie. And it has the same pattern. In a drama, you have a protagonist. The protagonist wants something. There's obstacles. You have a question about whether they'll get it, and then you get the answer. In a sequence, you have the same thing, often. You have a person who wants something, and it isn't always the protagonist of the movie. A protagonist of a sequence can be another character. But the character, the action is shaped by what the character wants. And you get a resolution, at least a partial resolution, at the end of the sequence, which releases the tension and gets you on to the next one. And tension is important. What keeps us there is the suspense surrounding the question of how it's going to come out. And it's important to give the audience not just the big release from the main tension, but when you have individual smaller tensions, you create them and you release them, create the tension, you release it. How many people have been on an airplane? I know, I'm safely assume most of you have been on an airplane. Well, this is about how the human nervous system responds to stimuli. If you're on an airplane, you notice the engines when the plane takes off. Once you're in flight, you stop noticing the engines, because it's become part of the background. It's all at the same level. And the corresponding thing in a movie is it's all at the same level and you're bored and you fall asleep. So the way successful filmmakers and writers do it is they vary the tension so you hear different levels of noise, in effect. The noise being the tension that the audience feels. So sequences can be unified mostly by that. Sometimes you'll see a sequence that's unified by a place, one location. Or an event. Sometimes it's a combination of place and event. Like in Fellowship of the Ring, there's one sequence that takes place in Rivendell. And the event is the Council of Elrond. And it's like a 20-minute short film that just takes place there, and it just has to do with that issue of what to do next in the rest of the story. But most of the time, when you look at the patterns, you'll see that it's about dramatic tension, which is why I wanted to talk about that before we get to sequences. Because what applies to movies as a whole applies to sequences. Now, historically, you probably, just like the person who didn't know that they were speaking prose their whole life without being made aware of it, movies began as sequences, really. Movies began when they began to be projected in 1897. They put the film, the celluloid, on these 1,000-foot reels, and you had an 8 to 12-minute experience.